If you don't know me, I'm Katie Roberts Hall. I'm the CEO of Think Forward Educators. And we have with us Dr. Tessa Daffern tonight. So this is going to be a session on implementing an effective multi-tiered system of support to teach spelling, which I think will be a very exciting topic. We had over now 800 people register for this event, and I know that a lot of people will want to watch the recording after that couldn't make it tonight. So just wanted to flag that the event is being recorded, which is great for anyone who couldn't attend, but just be aware of that in case you participate or ask any questions. I think that we have the chat there in case anybody does have any questions as we go on, but Tessa might take questions at the end of the presentation as well. So thank you all for joining. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting today, which for me are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I would like to introduce Dr. Tessa Daffern. Tessa Daffern is an adjunct associate professor in the Solder Lab at the School of Education at the La Trobe University and co-director at Literacy Education Solutions. And Tessa has contributed to education in various capacities for the past 20 years as a classroom teacher, teaching and learning specialist, academic, and literacy education advisor. And this is the second time that Tessa has presented to Think Forward Educators, and the first time we had really excellent feedback, just a ton of knowledge and information that our members found really useful. So I know that there was a lot of excitement to have you back today, Tessa. So I'll throw to you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's really a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for hosting and having me on the Think Forward Educators webinar. So thank you very much to everyone taking the time to join me this evening, and I do appreciate that many of you are approaching the end of a busy school semester, and you're likely to be in the thick of assessment and reporting. I know the feeling. I was there and I've done that before, so thank you. And I think your presence here either tonight or watching a recording of this really is testament to your commitment to improving the literacy skills of the students in your care. In this webinar, I'll provide an introductory overview of a multi-tiered system of support for teaching spelling. And I'd like to acknowledge at the outset that there is a limit to what I can share in this short time. I'd love to talk for hours on this topic, but I only have an hour or so. So I do welcome you to contact me directly to discuss this topic in more depth. What I'll do is I'll just share my PowerPoint screen and we'll get started. So here are my contact details, my personal email address and my company's email address. Also, I do have an address at La Trobe University. It's a bit tricky having 3 different email addresses, but you can certainly get in touch with me if you're interested to find out a bit more about this topic or would like to know how I might be able to support your school with implementation. And supporting schools in this space is what I'm particularly passionate about. Now, there were several questions that came through from registered participants, which I'm really grateful for. And many of them were actually, interestingly, on teaching spelling in years 3 to 6. So I have decided to focus more of my time on this context in the time that we've got, but I will briefly touch on other age groups as well. And I really had to pick and choose what to cover tonight. So I've decided I won't really have time to properly explain in any detail any instructional routines or scope and sequences for teaching spelling. I think to do that justice, I'd need probably another hour at least to do that. So there's quite a large corpus of both causal research evidence and also correlational research evidence. And collectively, that evidence highlights the importance of high quality spelling instruction. Teaching spelling well can improve students' spelling skills, their reading skills, vocabulary and compositional writing. And in turn, spelling proficiency can support students' self-efficacy and their confidence as literate contributors to their communities. Spelling, as I'm sure you know, is both a process and a product. As a product, it's a visible representation of word-level language and it incorporates written symbols in conventional sequences, which we know of as orthography. And those conventional sequences represent speech sounds, and we know that as phonology, and also word parts that signal meaning and grammar, which is all about the study of morphology. So my research, which stemmed from my PhD, has provided empirical evidence for this particular theoretical framework, triple word form theory. We now know that in the presence of explicit instruction of these three components, that and how to combine them, that students can utilize phonological, orthographic, and morphological skills from the beginning of learning to write. And over time, with explicit instruction, these component skills become increasingly integrated, whereby students can use and coordinate, or in other words, cross-map these components with increasing efficiency, accuracy, and autonomy when spelling. So my PhD research and subsequent studies have focused on developing and testing the psychometric properties of assessments, and also understanding the trajectory of learning and, of course, effective spelling instruction. And there's always more to learn. I think the journey with research in this space is certainly not at a full conclusion. So through the research, I've been able to provide some empirical support for triple word form theory and accompanying instructional resources to align with this theory. And the first assessment that I developed and psychometrically tested was part of my PhD. And that particular assessment is known as a spelling test. And that one is a real word test, uses real words. But since then, it has been my goal and my passion to expand on that initial assessment and develop other assessments to further validate the initial assessment, but to get more robust understanding of how children learn to spell, and then to undertake some intervention studies as well. And I guess the reason why I'm passionate about assessment in particular is because we know that the use of rigorous assessment and progress monitoring tools that do have strong psychometric properties, that is validity and reliability, and assessments that can inform instructional decisions are critical, especially when we're going to implement a multi-tiered system of support. So Tier 1 instruction, as I'm sure you are all aware, refers to evidence-based instructional practices and supports that are delivered essentially to all your students in your class. Tier 2 instruction can be provided in addition to Tier 1 instruction to small groups of students, but instruction for this group can still be aligned in content to what you're teaching as part of your Tier 1 instruction. But I guess the focus is more on providing a little bit more support, perhaps in small groups for those students in Tier 2 instructional sort of categories. And then Tier 3 instruction is further intensified, and that's in terms of duration and frequency. It's not necessarily that students need different instruction or content, it's more the duration and frequency, and also they may require one-to-one support. But importantly, spelling instruction is quite unique, and it requires a rather nuanced implementation of a multi-tiered support system, whereby instructional tiers may in fact need to differ for each spelling component for each student. And that sounds rather complex, so an easy solution is probably not the answer. So grouping students into tiers will likely need to be somewhat fluid and certainly responsive because of individual variances in spelling component skills. Now, we do want to improve all of our students' literacy skills. There's no doubt about that. But in doing so, we must carefully evaluate programs or resources before we adopt them. And in today's climate, probably more than ever, which is, I'm a little bit concerned about this, where I'm seeing spelling programs, resources, curriculums, scope and sequences rapidly recently being kind of pumped out and created, and some of them freely available, and all in good intentions. The rush to get all of this out means that we need to be even more careful about scrutinising these. So it's crucial to ensure that you do carefully review what's out there, as some of those resources may not necessarily all be genuinely evidence-based or quality assured, even though they may, in appear to endorse an explicit instructional approach, or may even claim to be, informed by triple word form theory, or even quality assured. So quality instruction, first of all, I think needs to start with robust, reliable, valid spelling error analysis data at all year levels, from foundation to year 6. And I would argue a case for year 7 and possibly even year 8 as well. So to avoid having a lot of children in intervention, targeted spelling, explicit spelling instruction in the components of spelling is needed. So a multi-tiered system of support for teaching spelling involves using objective, data-informed support systems of increasing the intensive instructional tiers. High quality evidence-based spelling instruction for all students in tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Valid and reliable standardized spelling error analysis. And if we're teaching in an Australian context, ideally, we want to be using Australian standardized norms, assessments. Examples of these that I have conducted that are based around triple word form theory are the COSTI, which stands for the components of spelling test for the early years, and the COST, which is for years 3 and up. And we do this, we can't hide from this data. It's objective, it's reliable, it's valid. And we do this because we want to identify and diagnose students who need additional support for the specific components of spelling, rather than just generally spelling overall. But not just students who need additional support, also for students who need extension. And we can't forget about those students. And not just spelling in general, but for the specific components of spelling. We also need to make sure that when we've got that data, we're explicitly teaching. So what we teach matters, and it needs to be based or aligned with the identified gaps and the strengths for each spelling component for all students. That means we need to be rather flexible and somewhat fluid in our grouping arrangements, so that we can tailor that explicit spelling instruction. And again, it comes back to knowing your students and having that valid and reliable data, so that we can make data-based decisions to determine the levels of support that students do require. And of course, we need to make sure we have ways to track progress or monitor for immediate and sustained impact. We need to do this in a way that allows us to check for acquisition of taught skills. So do students actually know? Have they acquired what we've taught them? Can they retain that in the long term? But probably more importantly, and I think this is where we sometimes maybe go wrong, is transfer. Are we seeing students transferring those skills to their everyday writing? And if we have a way to check that is valid and reliable, objective, then we can ensure that our teaching is impactful. And at the end of the day, that's really what matters. So as a quick example of what I mean by quality multi-tiered system of support for teaching spelling, there are different ways that researchers can ensure that an assessment is robust, or that it has strong psychometric properties. So things like validity. So the spelling error analysis assessments that I've developed are grounded in triple word form theory. So from a theoretical perspective, they've got validity, and that's evidenced by their structure with the constructs that are in there. But also empirical validation can be valid, can provide that validity. For example, through statistical measures like factor analysis, and even interrater correlations with other established measures. And of course, expert and blind review processes all contribute to that validity. Reliability is also important, and that in the COST and the COSTIs been measured through internal consistency measures. There's also item difficulty, and that can be conducted by looking at item variance and ceiling effects. And also a robust assessment is one that ensures that we are able to make comparative judgments. So a norm reference tool is always helpful, but also being mindful of where those norms derive from. Are they Australian-based, for example, and when was that norm population tested as well? So as some quick examples, this table here illustrates the reliability results for the COST, the real word version, which is the one that I first developed as part of my PhD. And here I have a table that shows the reliability results for the COST, which is the pseudo-word version of the assessments. And this one really has 3 separate assessments that can be administered separately or all together. And of course, the morphological assessment is one that has context, sentence level context to it. You can't measure morphology without the sort of semantic kind of context to go with it. So the components of spelling tests are used for diagnostic purposes, as well as for comparative judgments and also longitudinal tracking. And they've adopted a valid and reliable sort of error analysis scoring system based on words that students write to dictation, rather than simply a process of scoring whole words as either correct or incorrect. So it makes these assessments quite unique and very much suited to a multi-tiered support system of instruction. And in terms of validity, test validity, this table here provides data, some other results from other data that I've got. This is year 5 data. And in this particular table, it shows how the 3 component spelling skills as measured by the COST correlate with both reading and compositional writing as measured by NAPLAN. And unsurprisingly, the overall highest correlations are between the spelling components as measured by using the COST and with NAPLAN spelling. So that's no particular surprise there, but they are related with reading and writing as well. And in this particular data, you can see that the morphological component of all 3 components is particularly quite powerful, and you can see that morphology is a very strong predictor of reading, writing, and spelling, more so than the other components, which in itself is quite interesting, aside from the fact that it does provide some evidence of validity for the actual assessment tool. So for both the COSTI and the COST real word assessments, one of the challenges is that, as I'm sure you may be aware, to do a spelling error analysis can take time. So quite a few years ago, I was aiming to develop an online platform that could automate all of this to save teachers considerable time. And after a lot of work and trialing, I was able to get there. So I've got that for the early years assessment and for the upper years. Obviously, the early years, the COSTI, students are too generally not fluent enough to be able to type the words. So there is a process in getting the teachers to type the words that the students have handwritten carefully, and then all of the errors are automated. But for older students, year 3 and above, they simply type the words and all of the errors are automatically analysed. And also with that, you get all of the scores, the raw scores, but you also get the percentiles and the standardised data included with that automatically. And this information is particularly critical for identifying students who may require Tier 2 and Tier 3 instruction. And then more recently, I've been able to transfer all of the resources and activities that I've developed and worked with and trialled in various schools over the years and through randomised controlled trials as well into a dashboard. And so this COST dashboard provides teachers with a suite of instructional resources to accompany the assessment data. And so the activities themselves are also automatically mapped for each student based on their spelling error analysis data. So because the COST activities are tailored from the error analysis data, they're suitable for all students in years 3 to 6, and also for students in the secondary years who may need Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventional support. And I am actually working on this dashboard for the early years at the moment. It's a massive project and requires a lot of testing and coding behind it. But I'm going to just move away from my PowerPoint now, and I'm going to quickly show you what the dashboard looks like before I go into a little bit more sort of technical information. So just bear with me as I stop sharing my slide, and I will share my screen again in a moment. I'm just going to log in to the dashboard. So the teacher gets a login, and once they've got their login, they can access the dashboard. So I'm going to share my screen again now, and you'll be able to see a demo version of what the dashboard looks like. So this is the home page, and the teacher can log in and see their class results. They get a snapshot of the students in their class in terms of their results. They can download that report that has the raw scores and percentiles and color-coded instructional recommendations in an Excel format. They can access some analytics, and it's a little bit interactive, so they can have a look at the students in their class to see what sort of gaps there might be and what's weaker, what's stronger, just at a very quick glance as well. In the future, students who have done the test in multiple years consecutively, there'll be longitudinal data that the school can access as well for each student, for each component, and also combined as well. I've got the tailored activities that are mapped from the error analysis, which I'll come to very soon, but there are a range of other resources on here. For example, lesson planning tools that provide teachers with examples of how they might scope and sequence their lessons, plan out their instruction across a given year and across the school or the years. I've also got some handwriting templates that I've created that teachers can download and use if they wanted to, or for explicit instruction, so that spelling and handwriting can be taught together. I've also got some progress monitoring tools in here. So, for example, there's an assessment schedule that includes, that covers all the way from foundation and upwards. The pseudo-word assessment is here for Year 3 and Year 4 and Year 5 and 6. So you simply click on that and you will be able to access the actual assessment itself for the pseudo-word test, which can be helpful for maybe mid-year progress monitoring if you wanted to. And the norms are all there and the scoring templates are all there. In addition to that, I've also got some other monitoring tools. It's like a spreadsheet that allows the teachers to, I think I need to share the spreadsheet itself, but track progress using sort of a 3 kind of level progress monitoring system, acquisition, retention, transfer for all the taught skills that they are teaching. And that's one of my new little additions to this dashboard. I've also got multimedia support here with various informational videos on various aspects of teaching spelling, and I'll continue to add information to this because I think part of the implementation process is making sure that teachers have all the supports around them, the information to build their capacity around the linguistic concepts and pedagogy as well. So in fact, schools that do use this also have access to some free little kind of information sort of coaching Q&A sessions with me throughout the year as well. And some schools also have access to additional word analysis resources that they can access to link the teaching of vocabulary with the teaching of spelling. And all of these ones here, I won't open them all up, but they're all examples that I've created, so they're annotated examples. I've also got what's particularly useful are all the tailored activities for each component. And you can access this by individual students or as a whole class. So for example, for the phonological component, based on the errors, you can click on P1, P2, P3, P4, which all relate to particular codes in the actual test. And I've got examples of activities that you might do for those students. And some of those are, where relevant, they are differentiated. And in general, I've got them categorized into kind of 2 overarching groups. Either, this is orthography, a consolidation and extension task, which might be for students who have scored higher in a particular concept. So these students might be, the students who've done quite well. And then for students who are allocated a support and consolidation task, are those students who might have scored a slightly lower score for that particular concept. So they might be, your tier 2 kind of level of instructional students. And the tier 3 students would be captured in here as well. So there's opportunities for tier 1 and tier 2 instruction, and students who are further behind can use additional resources that are here. There's quite a few for each concept that they can use for revision purposes and extra intervention. So the teachers can access all of these. So O1 refers to words that have long I. O2 are words that have long A, and there's lots of resources there. I've got little audio files that I've created as well. They're just short bite-sized audio files of me demonstrating certain concepts that relate to what's in the activity. O3 relates to words with long E, O4 relates to words with long I, and so on. And I've got the same thing with morphology. So M1 are your inflected suffixes, and M2 are derivational suffixes, and so on. So I've got various morphological concepts there. And some of these also have PowerPoint slides that teachers can use for explicit teaching if they wanted to. So teachers can click on these links and it opens up with a series of activities that they can use flexibly. So for example, I'll give you one example here. Let's say I have this task here is a consolidation and an extension task, and it's focusing on words with long I. So even though it's an orthographic task, the students are looking at graphemes for, long I. But the focus here is also on using nouns so that you can use those words to map them to a morphological task later on. And then I'll have a support and consolidation version of that as well. That might be the same sort of activity, but a little bit easier. And I've got that for all of these different concepts. Oops. So for example, long O, if I've got words with long O, graphemes with long O here, I might have, for example, let's see, this one here is a consolidation and an extension task. I'll open this up and you'll see some of these words are fairly complex and there's not so much of a scaffold here because the students need to work out what the graphemes are for that long O phoneme and pop that in there with the words. I've got some instructional notes and suggestions for where to next. So all of these words are nouns, so you could potentially teach the plural suffix to accompany that after that. So that would be a more complex task, and often it might be because there's less scaffolding in place. The words might be more complex. There might be a few more graphemes. An easier version of that task might be similar, but there might be fewer words. The words might be simpler. There might be a bit more scaffolding in place. So this would be an example here of sort of an equivalent. The words are not as complex. I've also got the grapheme specified for the words so the students have that scaffold in place. But in this example, they're still all nouns. So while it's an orthographic task, the teachers can use this to progress into a morphological lesson if they wanted to, if that's part of the scope and sequence, to teach, how to add a plural suffix to these words using generalizations. That's just one of many examples. And some activities have, some of these activities that you can open up have lots of questions to allow for consolidation and extra practice. So the teacher can make a judgment as to which of those activities might be best suited for the students, depending on, that progress monitoring, how much support that they might need. And, some of the activities that I have, like I said, have PowerPoint presentations to support teachers with their explicit instruction. Here's just an example. So, this is an example of comparing IAN with ION. I've got handwriting lines so the teacher can model handwriting the words during that instructional practice, and examples of how you use these words in sentences, which I think is very important, and then generalizations to go with that as well. Excuse me, I just need to cough for a little bit. I do have a bit of a cold that I'm recovering from, so just bear with me. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint now. I've given you a little taster of what's in the dashboard and what it looks like. So it can be used quite flexibly. And just to give you a bit more context about, where this all came about, this particular instructional approach stems from intervention studies, including randomised controlled trials. And the first of those was conducted in an Australian context, where I sought to address the question, do students who receive instruction that is explicit and informed by spelling error analysis data demonstrate greater improvements in spelling than students involved in the comparison classes, which were following a business as usual approach? So teachers in the intervention group received a full day training with me prior to their implementation of the approach. And in addition, they met a few times with me for some coaching sessions where we were engaged in lesson planning, developing resources, and evaluating lessons as well. Also, in terms of this design, the teachers used the online assessment tool for the valid and reliable error analysis data. So they got all that data. Their structure was informed by triple word form theory. So, sorry, I'll just have a drink of water. Damn that cold. Sorry about that. Okay, so their instructional routine was informed by triple word form theory, which meant that they were using the 3 components and teaching those on a regular basis. The learning intentions were also clear when they were teaching their lessons. They followed a gradual release of responsibility approach. They provided lots of consolidation and in particular making connections with sentence level writing so that the students were transferring their learning to their sentence level writing. The intervention also involved them teaching spelling at least 3 times a week, ideally 4 lessons a week, and about 20 minutes for each lesson. The learning that they engaged their students in was cumulative and it was spaced. So without going into any detail now, but it was kind of using a horizontal and a vertical kind of structure sequence to make sure that learning was cumulative and spaced. But that formative and summative assessment was also part of this approach. Dictation tasks and closed passages, error analysis was all part of that. So every class that was involved in the intervention in about a term made a statistically significant improvement. In contrast, the schools that were part of the intervention, that were not part of the intervention following a business as usual approach, didn't make that statistically significant improvement. So this is the kind of overall structure that the intervention classes across 2 schools followed, but with flexibility. In some cases, it was a weekly sort of cycle. Other times it was a fortnightly cycle. It was a bit dependent on student data, what was being taught. Sometimes there was more of a focus on morphology. It really just depended very much on student learning and the acquisition and transfer skills that were happening. But in this model, vocabulary instruction was embedded, handwriting instruction was encouraged as part of that model. Oral language was part of this. So when even discussing words, making sure children can pronounce the words and use them in sentences, through to using words with morphological complexity, changing the sentence structures in those words at the oral level, as well as at the written level. So it was quite a kind of an interactive kind of spelling approach where the process of learning to spell was connected with the process of reading and writing as well. In contrast, the schools that were following a business as usual approach, generally, there wasn't really that explicit instruction occurring, although some teachers said that they were teaching somewhere between 30 minutes to 1 hour a week. 2 classes said that there was no instruction occurring at all. So some of the teachers said that spelling is not taught during class time, rather word lists are sent home at the start of each week. One teacher said, I don't really teach spelling specifically in my classroom. What was very common was rote learning tasks. such as look, say, cover, write, check. That was very common. And there was some incidental phonics-based tasks occurring with commercial workbooks being used in some cases. Two classes were actually using a workbook that leveled students, and it was based on actually 10-word accuracy spelling tests. But when I was reviewing a lot of these resources, some of which were freely available, some were commercial, a bit of this and a bit of that was kind of going on in some of these classes. There were errors in some of those resources or misconceptions around, content knowledge, linguistic knowledge about words. And some of the activities were quite random. They were games with no clear learning intentions. So, for example, teachers said that the teaching was incidental, and if a word comes up in maths or inquiry, science, students can choose an activity. These range from uppercase, lowercase, backwards words, silly sentences, making riddles using their words. So they're the sorts of examples of what happened in the business as usual practice. Here's a more fine-grained example of what one of the classes adopted. So this on the left shows the 10 words that the students were assessed on, and it was that kind of assessment that hasn't, to my knowledge, got the validity, reliability behind it to determine whether it is in itself an objective test with good psychometric properties, but yet that was used to determine the levels for the students. And then the activities themselves were very much based on what I could see as kind of somewhat random words and a lot of, rote learning kind of approaches or whole word learning approaches, and proofreading and editing tasks as well that I see more as not so much as a learning task. In fact, when students are seeing incorrectly spelled words on a frequent basis, it might only reinforce incorrect spelling rather than support them with correct spelling. So there's a few issues around the quality of the instruction, the lack of explicit instruction, and more importantly, the lack of using error analysis data to inform that teaching. So not surprisingly, the classes that were following the business as usual practice did not make statistically significant improvements. And so that's very telling in itself. Now, the study that I conducted that I've just described to you was also replicated and extended in a UK context. So in the UK context, the teachers were using the Components of Spelling Test, the online platform, and followed very much the same approach to the study I described. And they added other measures to this particular study and lengthened the duration of the study as well. And in that study, significant additional improvements in spelling across all grades in the intervention groups over the comparison groups that didn't receive intervention were evident. And just really quickly, here are some of the comments that the teachers said after that particular trial. I'll just give you a moment just to read the comments that some of the teachers made from that particular trial. And just to note that I didn't conduct this trial myself, but I did provide the training to the teachers at the very start of the trial. So I'll give you a moment just to read some of the comments that the teachers said about this particular experience. So from a qualitative perspective, in addition to the empirical evidence, the teachers could see improvements in their students, not just in their spelling, but also in their writing, as these quotes from the teachers who participated in that study indicate. And in addition to that, I've had some lovely positive feedback from teachers who have been using the cost dashboard that I shared with you recently. So here are just some of the comments that they have made regarding that, that particular resource. So I'll just let you read these yourself now. the automaticity of the error analysis and then putting the students all into groups has been a huge time saver for teachers. It gives them the capacity then just to get on with the job of focusing on their instruction itself. Teachers are very excited to receive their data as well. They find it really quite intriguing, sometimes really reinforcing as well, because it sort of reaffirms what they sort of already knew about their students, but also sometimes it gives them some surprising results that they need to then look into further. But of course, like any program or approach, support for teachers, I think, is really important. And that sometimes I think can make or break the success of any approach. And so my commitment is to always, strive to provide those supports for the students through videos that I have on the dashboard. I've also got a YouTube channel, but also having some sessions available for drop-in sort of Q&A sessions for the teachers using the dashboard, because sometimes, these random kind of questions come up about implementation that are very context or school or individual teacher student specific, that really need to be unpacked. So the teaching of spelling, like the teaching of learning, is incredibly complex. So a simple solution to teaching spelling is not really, I think, the answer. So this is what I've been working on towards. If you do want to find out more about the cost dashboard, here's a QR code that takes you to a little information sheet about the actual dashboard itself. But it's also on my website. So I'm going to also highlight a study that was, an article that was recently published with some lovely colleagues of mine from Burke Ward Public School that have shared this journey with me. And I've had the absolute privilege of working with them along with many other schools. And we've co-authored this paper that was published in Learning Difficulties by Learning Difficulties Australia. And it shows sort of a large-scale project involving the early years, and also honing in on one case study, one school, to see what's happened in that, the journey that they have experienced. And so just as a quick glance, one of the figures that are in that article shows some consistent longitudinal growth, not across just one cohort of students, but 4 different cohorts of students for all 3 components. And so that consistent longitudinal growth shows, that it is possible to implement an evidence-based approach that is nuanced, that looks at really tiering the instruction, but based on error analysis for the 3 components. It's not an easy journey, and it takes time to get it right, and persistence, and constant sort of collaboration with the whole school leadership team and the staff. So, and also over here, I'm just going to kind of pivot a little bit. And this is kind of addressing some of the comments that, or questions that came up from some of the registered participants around teaching spelling for older students. Now, this here provides a bit of broadly representative Australian population kind of insights, not school specific. And I think it might be sort of helpful just to have a little look at this. So this is the pseudo word assessment, the 3 components. And what stands out here, if you look at the yellow columns for year 5 and 6, the phonological score is somewhat fairly low as the average kind of, or the mean accuracy score, in fact, lower than orthography and morphology. And so what this suggests is that there is still learning to be made, not just in orthography and morphology, but for phonology as well, for students, even as they are entering the secondary school years. I'm going to go into the phonological component in a little bit more detail. This is actually from the real word test. This comes from my PhD. And interestingly, the findings that you see here, the trends, I guess we can call them, the cross-sectional trends, are similar to the trends I've seen with the pseudo word assessment, whereby even students in the 90th percentile are kind of finishing primary school with still not entirely mastering their phonological capacity to spell words. And I know this is just one element of it, but it is something that we shouldn't ignore. And here's one example. So the word is substantial. And these scores that you see, the changes in these scores are purely explained by students' ability to spell polysyllabic words, and in particular, the middle part of those words that do have a regularity to them. So, for example, if I were to sound out the word substantial, s, a, b, s, t, a, n, and then shul, that part there is morphologically complex. But most of the word, and in the middle part, there's nothing tricky about it if you know your phoneme grapheme correspondences. But because it's in a long word and it's in the middle of a long word, phonological working memory can kind of get in the way and cause these sorts of spelling mistakes that you see here. And even students who might be perceived to be quite high achieving spellers may still very well be making these sorts of mistakes. So it is still going to form part of our comprehensive approach to teaching spelling, even for students who are high achieving spellers. Whereas in the orthographic component for high achieving spellers, there appears to be somewhat a bit of a ceiling effect. And I think I saw this also with the pseudo word assessment data. So what this suggests is that at a certain point, children get to the point where they know a lot about the conventional sequences of the English written language. But what they're now still learning is perhaps word-specific knowledge. So this suggests that as children get older, and especially if they're already quite good spellers, the focus of the spelling needs to probably shift more to a focus on building tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary, not to confuse that with the levels of intervention, but the types of words that students are learning. So I don't have time to go into that, but I have a little YouTube video that I've created, and here's the QR code to it. So you might want to capture that now, save it for another time. And it's just a little example of how you can use this particular workbook, which is called Spelling Out Words. It's just a reference book. It's not like a traditional spelling workbook. It's a book that students can use to collate their own personalised vocabulary, but in a very structured and linguistically kind of structured way. And so this word, Spelling Out Words book could be used in conjunction with teaching vocabulary. Anyway, so the video that I have here talks a little bit about how you can combine vocabulary and spelling instruction, which is probably what needs to really be the focus. Choosing words thoughtfully, choosing words to teach spelling that will improve students' vocabulary, breadth and depth, rather than just rehashing these are graphemes for long A and these are graphemes for long O. Students might already know that, or some students might already know that. So the focus needs to be on building their vocabulary knowledge. So this kind of approach that I describe in this little video, it's nothing, not a professional kind of video or anything, it's just me explaining an approach here. It's suitable for tier 1 instruction, I would say from year 3 and upwards. And also, in addition to this, I would suggest for secondary students who may require tier 2 and tier 3 intervention, they may use the cost dashboard tailored activities that are based on the error analysis data to as the extra support that they might need to further their spelling skills if they need that. And now to morphology. This comes also from my PhD. And again, fairly similar trends that I observed with the pseudo word assessment. What I guess this really highlights is that the scores in general are quite low, especially at the start of in year 3. We really should not and don't need to wait until we get our NAPLAN results in year 3 to start teaching morphology. If we start to teach morphology much earlier, indeed, I would say from the first year of school, quite early on, we won't necessarily see such low scores. And so I think the teaching of morphology also needs to be very targeted, but it also needs to be starting much earlier. I'm going to shift to very briefly just for those attendees who might like to know a little bit about the early years. So the early years components of spelling assessment that I have is also aligned with triple word form theory, and it has the 3 components. But being the early years, it's a much more, even more fine-grained assessment, because you really want to know which graphemes the students can spell in the context of a word or words. So essentially, these are 3 separate assessments, not just one big assessment. And I do have an assessment schedule that accompanies this. So most schools just use the phonological component to assess the students in the foundation year after about 6 months of instruction in phonics. And then in year 1 and year 2, once a year, the teachers assess using all 3 components to get a really good understanding of students' knowledge of phonics as applied to spelling, but also morphology. And so the online platform provides all of that error analysis data mapped to percentiles and Z-scores, and they're all mapped then to color-coded instructional recommendations. So the manual itself has information about all these different codes, what they all are, with suggested activities. But of course, being in the early years, the systematic phonics sequence that the school already hopefully adopts still is followed, but this data then helps to ensure that the teachers are extending the students if they can be extended, or providing extra support for students if they need that extra support, or even revisiting concepts that have been taught if necessary. And you can't hide from spelling data, especially if it's gone through validity and reliability checking. It's quite objective, non-biased kind of data that you just can't hide away from. So just really quickly as one example, this is looking at skills for the letter D to represent the D sound. So it's a single letter grapheme. And typically in a given class, you will have variants, even if you've got the best instructional approach happening, you will have individual variants in your class, like this sort of data shows. You'll have some students who have no demonstrated knowledge of that in their spelling, some who have a little bit, and some who have a lot. So how do you support that variance in your class within a multi-tiered approach? So without going into too much depth, I'm going to give you a really quick example, and I hope it's not going to be misinterpreted because there is so much more I can share. So it's just a little tiny snapshot. So let's assume that I've got one student who is only just starting to learn it for the first time. I might give them a decodable text that is at the lower level where the letter D is introduced, and I might get them to combine the reading. So they're going to decode that text, skim and scan the text, and look for words that have the D sound written with the letter D, and get them to handwrite those words. So in that context, there might only be 4 words, and that grapheme occurs at the end of the word, and the words are CVC words, quite simple structures. But then I might have a student who can read independently at a slightly higher level text. So that text will have more words, and those words might have slightly different, structures as well, linguistic structures. So there's a little bit more of a task there. But then I might have a student who is reading at a higher level, and so their text might have even more words. And the task I might give them might be, let's find words that start with D for the D sound and end with the letter D for the D sound or phoneme. So there's a bit of an analysis that has to happen as part of that task, which in itself adds more complexity. And that may be suitable for a student in that class. So even though I'm following a sequence, I have 3 potential slightly varied versions of that task if I have to. And I may not always need to do it that way, but it's not onerous on the teacher in terms of making that point of differentiation. And you never know, you might have a student who's even way beyond that. Well, why not? They may not even need a decodable text. They might have another text that's more complex, and they can identify words that have the D sound in the first position, the initial position, or maybe the second, it may not apply in this case, the third position of the word. So in these words, they can hear the D sound as the 3rd phoneme in the word, or in this case, the 4th phoneme in the word, or in this case, the 5th phoneme in the word. And notice that they're writing the words. They're not just reading, but they're writing. And that handwriting will support that orthographic mapping. So you might have situations where You don't want to stifle students' skills in both reading and spelling. And if you've got data to give you that information that says, okay, I know that I can challenge this student, don't hesitate and don't hold them back. It's not fair for those students if you have a situation like that. And the same thing applies with the orthographic component, which looks at graphings for the long vowels and some graphings for certain positional constraints. You will have variance in your class. And I think that's why teaching spelling is so hard, because trying to, make a sort of a one-size-fits-all approach is not necessarily the best way to go about it. And I think sometimes if we try to, what do people say? Fit a square peg in a round hole. That might be, on the surface easy and, we're clean, but it's not necessarily the best approach. And then here, again, the morphological component can be nuanced as well. And again, we will have certain skills that students can bring to the classroom that we need to keep progressing them forward, and other students who might need a more scaffolded, simplified task, and other students who really need that support with writing. But importantly, we can still teach children about morphology, even if they only know a small handful of single letter graphings, like the ones you see here. They can start to add the plural marker S to words like the ones you see here, and that might be the start of their morphological journey. But of course, from there, that's when you start to teach generalizations for the various prefixes and suffixes, but always make sure that there's opportunities for transfer. Practice writing these words in different sentence constructions right from the very beginning, which means you might need to slow down the progression of learning and the content that you cover to ensure that you are going deep with the learning. So in sum, teaching spelling effectively involves building that support mechanism for the teachers so that they've got strong pedagogical content knowledge that supports then a whole school consistent practice. Everyone is on the same page, using the same language, and even assessment processes too. Knowing the students using valid and reliable error analysis data, which will then inform a multi-tiered approach, explicitly teaching the strategies and generalizations based on that error analysis that has ideally gone through some psychometric testing, and informed by triple word form theory, including the 3 components of spelling as part of your teaching on a regular basis. You can't explicitly teach spelling without using the meta language. And I've seen great examples of 5-year-old children using words like, this is a base word, this is a suffix, this is a digraph, this is a long vowel, this is a short vowel. If you use the language, the students will be able to use that language as well. And we should not underestimate students' capacity to learn about this. Importantly, and I think that this is sometimes where we do go a bit wrong, is selecting words to teach spelling that are relevant to the teaching focus, but also words that are new to the students, that are challenging, that will extend their vocabulary. There's no point teaching students words if they already know how to spell those words. You'll be wasting your time and their time. So the selection of words is not something necessarily that a program can kind of give you and tell you. To some extent, that might be a starting point, but to some extent, it is going to be teacher judgment and knowing your students to determine which words they really need to learn, so that they also connect with texts that they're learning, that they're reading, topics that they're studying across different subject areas. Keep your explicit teaching episodes short, sharp, and focused, but regular, 4 times or 5 times a week if you can, and always follow through with consolidation. Spacing that learning out a little bit every day is more powerful than once or twice a week. And always in a range of writing contexts, that consolidation needs to happen not just at the word list level, but at the sentence level, to ensure that we have acquisition, followed by retention, followed by transfer. And we can only do that if we regularly monitor the progress of the students. We want to ensure handwriting is embedded into our spelling instruction, especially in the early years, and learning intentions are visible, and that we provide immediate, specific, and ongoing feedback. I do have a suggested schedule for spelling assessment. Here's a QR code that will take you to that if you're interested. And my voice is just about gone. So here are my contact details, and I'm happy to take on any questions that you might have. And like I said, feel free to get in touch with me if you'd like to find out more about this, or if you'd like to find out how I might be able to support you in your school with implementation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tessa. I'm just looking at the chat just to see if there's any questions. I think you linked in or put some QR codes up about the ways that people can find out more. So I think there'll probably be some questions answered just by looking at that. But if anyone does have questions, I know we're kind of at time now, but if you have any, you can put in the chat or take yourself off mute. And then the rest of you, thank you so much for coming. Oh, someone mentioned, can you go back to the QR code for the assessment on the second to last slide?
Yes, sure. For the assessment schedule, was that?
I think that's what they're mentioning, yes.
Sure.
That.
Here, and by the way, that it is on my website anyway, so if you can't get this now, on my website, I do have a resources tab with quite a few resources that you can download and make use of freely. So, but like I said, feel free to get in touch with me if you have any follow-up questions at all. Someone asked about the cost for the cost. Access to the dashboard for the whole year, including the error analysis, is $110 for a whole class. So it's quite cheap. And that includes access to some Zoom sessions with me for the year. But the school does need to have the manual to accompany that. And that essentially provides a license for the school to use the assessment, with each class having the manual itself. But once the school has the manual, the access to the online assessment and the dashboard, the one that I showed you before, is $110 for a whole year for the school to access.
Great. That's really helpful. Somebody asked about sharing the slides. I don't know if you'll be able to share the slides, but we will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording. So if you need to go back through the recording, you can look at that. And if you want to send any specific websites or resources in that follow-up email, we can, Tessa. But like you said, a lot of it's on your website probably, so that might be the best way to find things.
And I think that the information sheet that maybe you might have has a list of my publications that relate to what we've been talking about. So most of them are, journal articles, which I can't just freely share, unfortunately. So you might be able to get hold of them through your library database that you have access to. But if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with me at any time. I always like to communicate with schools and answer questions as they come up. So, and thank you again, everyone, for your time this evening. I really do appreciate that.
Yeah. Maybe we'll just take one more question and then we'll head out, since I know it's past time. But this one from Polly was interesting. What's the time frame you would anticipate a school takes to go from training to implementation?
Oh, such a great question. It has varied a lot, and it depends on staff turnover very much. So, and it also depends on whether the school, within the leadership team of the school, whether they also allocate time for teachers to meet together, to discuss, to reflect on their lessons. If that's happening, you'll certainly see strong implementation after about a year. But sometimes I feel like even the second year is almost that time where teachers are starting to get their head around things and can really consolidate and refine their practice. So even, the third year, that's when schools are going, yep, okay, we're onto this now, we know what we're doing. But it is very much a collective effort. It's not just I go in and do professional learning and off we go. It takes time. So I would say, to do it really well, give it at least, I think, 2 years before you can confidently say, yes, we're on board with this. Although, I've had schools that have had, like rural and regional schools that have had higher staff turnover, just that's the nature of their school context. And so I do find that they need a lot more support. They need a lot more revisiting of professional learning for the staff.
Mm.